Recording in
And it's been
progress.
kind of interesting reflecting back over those 40 years. As you can imagine, there are highs and there are lows. There are moments that you would really not rather live over again, thank you very much. And there are moments that have been truly joyful. And many of those joyful moments have been spent here on the seacoast, where, as I say, for 8.5 years before retiring a couple years ago, I served the two congregations that formed what at that time was known as the Seacoast Shared Ministry. And it's kind of cool that they have graduated. Trinity Hampton is back to being a mission of its own. And now Christ Church in Portsmouth is what's been described as a gospel-oriented community, which is a brand new designation in the canons of the Diocese of New Hampshire, but it kind of means you can do your own thing and nobody's going to get in your way. I think that's kind of cool. But one of the observations I've made over these 40 years of ordained ministry is that the things that really matter, the things that really count, aren't the big things. Now, that's not to say big things aren't important. Moments that are sort of a spiritual high, you'll go off on a retreat, or you'll go to a conference of some sort and get filled with some new ideas and some thoughts. Things like a convention. I remember some years ago, many years ago, because I've been at this for a while, I was at a general convention in Indianapolis, and that was an exciting thing. But the moments that for me really ended up meaning the most were those little moments in the lives of people when, not through any great extraordinary thing that they had done, but simply through living their lives, somehow their relationship with Christ was deepened, and somehow their service to the community in which they lived was made meaningful. And so often it happens in small ways. In some ways I see that reflected in the words that Jesus speaks to us in the gospel today. He talks about a prophet coming among them. Isn't that really wonderful? It's great when a prophet comes, and if you receive a prophet as a prophet, you'll get a prophet's reward, and so on and so forth. But then he says that wonderful little phrase, even if you give a cup of cold water to some thirsty person, you will receive God's reward. The little things really do make a difference. And one of the things that did for me was really color how I looked at mission in our congregations. We so often, we were sort of waiting for that very special moment when some big thing could happen, some big moment, some big opportunity. Maybe some money fell in our lap and we were able to do some big thing. 20 years ago, I was in a congregation that had a capital campaign. We raised $850,000. But you know what? I actually look upon that as one of the lowlights of my ministry, because that led to some conflict that later tore that place to pieces. But the little things, those moments of sharing a cup of cold water with somebody, it's not about having great intelligence or great ideas or great courage or great knowledge. Sometimes it's every day living your life, following Christ, doing the best you can, and discovering that the journey itself is the journey, not the destination. And over the years, that has given me great joy. Sometimes Jesus reminds us, it doesn't have to be overcomplicated. It doesn't have to be big. It is open to anyone, and I suggest to you it is open to everyone. I think that's what that whole thing Paul talks about when he describes all the gifts of the Spirit in the 12th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And he names a whole bunch of different gifts, and he says, not everybody's going to get all of them. But you're going to get at least one or two. Use it. Do something with it. Make a difference with it. Touch your world with it. Or if I can quote our presiding bishop, never a bad guy to quote, be the Jesus movement, and by those little things you can change the world. One of the things I remember very early in my ministry was, at that time I was rector of a church in the suburbs of Boston. And one of the things that goes, first of all, with being in the Diocese of Massachusetts, which I'm convinced had a greater multiplicity of meetings than any other diocese on the planet, but we often had to travel into Boston. I did not like driving into Boston. Especially I didn't like driving on the Southeast Expressway. And so more often than not, I would take the commuter train. And it was always an experience getting on the commuter train, because I'm convinced that a commuter train is a wonderful microcosm of society as a whole. And I remember this one particular occasion. I got on the train at Norwood Central, and I came up the steps, and the train was absolutely, utterly already packed. It starts out in Franklin and makes its way up. So by the time we got to Norwood, it was about 20 miles into its journey, and it was already just jammed to the walls. And this young woman who was about out to here with child got on at the same time I did. And it was an elderly person sitting in one of the seats near the door who got up from his seat to give her a seat. Not one of the business types who were all busily reading their newspapers, and of course this was enough years ago, it wasn't talking on their cell phones, it was reading their newspapers. That's kind of one difference from 25 years ago to now. But they're oblivious. Because what are they? They're on their way into Boston to their important job, where they're going to be the big shot who makes a difference. They're there in their suit and their tie, and they're looking spiffy, and they're looking great, and they're going to make a difference with whatever it is they're doing in Boston. But here's this pregnant woman, and think about it for a moment, because I'll bet you anything the elderly person that got up to give her a seat themselves were given a seat earlier in the journey. It took one who had received a little cup of water to give a little cup of water. And that really is life, isn't it? That really is life. That is what's going on in the world. We see it all around us if we're, and this is the important message I want you to take home today, if we're looking for it. If we're sitting behind our figurative newspapers, how many people actually read those anymore? I admit I do, but I'm old. We get lost in our social media and all the stuff that makes up our lives. But Jesus calls us to notice people. Jesus calls us, yes, to notice the prophets in our midst. Yes, to notice the disciples in our midst. Yes, to notice the big things. That's fine. I'm all excited about noticing when something big comes along. But to notice the people around us. To notice the hungers around us. To notice the thirsts around us. To notice that all God's creation matters. And it really all goes back to the very beginning of creation, does it not? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then we'll put an ellipsis in there, ... and God created humankind in God's own image. Male and female, he created them. God created us. What's God's image look like? Well, we don't know what God physically looks like, do we? Because God's not got one of those. What makes us be in the image of God? It's how God-like we are. It is how we reflect the reality of God in our lives and, in essence, come out of the shell of just trying to survive, trying to just get through the next day, trying to meet our own needs, trying to be selfish about life, and notice and serve others. That's the difference between humanity and the rest of creation. It's what makes us who we are. We read a story this morning, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because it's one of the more disturbing stories in Scripture, and I don't care to spend a lot of time doing disturbing stories at the moment, but, you know, the whole story of the near sacrifice of Isaac. And ultimately, the message of that story obviously is one of obedience, obviously is one of God's call to Abraham. But that it's Isaac matters. This child, and remember, this is a society, you've probably been told this somewhere before, that children were not looked upon with the kind of honor our society kind of looks on children. Children weren't looked at that way. Isaac mattered. Isaac was important. God knew all along what God was going to do in that story. He wanted to see how far Abraham would go, but he knew from the beginning that Isaac mattered. Now, we fast forward into the New Testament. We fast forward into the story of Jesus, and Jesus is constantly doing things that remind us that it is the little things by which we can be agents of God in the world. And he talks about giving a cup of cold water to somebody who's thirsty. But then there's that moment when he washes the disciples' feet. And then there's that moment, what utter simplicity this is, when he says, "Here, eat some bread. And when you do it, remember me. Drink this cup. And when you do it, this cup will become for you my blood shed for you." You know, it's entirely possible that if Jesus had been an Episcopalian, am I glad? If Jesus had been an Episcopalian, he would have come up with all kinds of rules and regulations and canons and conventions and, all kinds of complicated ways to say, this is how you remember me. And what did he do? He said, nope. Eat some bread, drink some wine. And then just to throw another layer into that, the Greek word that is used to describe remember is a really special one, anamnesis, which means a remembering that makes present. So you don't remember me as a past reality. Oh, remember back in the days when Jesus did such and such and so. Isn't that wonderful? How great Jesus. Oh, no. It's to be Jesus now. When I eat that bread, when I drink that cup, my call is to now go out and look at the world now with Jesus' eyes. To see that world differently because I have done that. Anamnesis. I have remembered Jesus, and now I'm going to make Jesus present. thinking back over those 40 years of ministry, one of the things I remember, I'm going to say it's from maybe 20-ish years ago. I'm hesitant to name a date, but you'll remember this, those of you who have been around long enough. When they used to have those little rubber wristbands, and of course there had rubber wristbands for just about everything. It seemed like every time there was a cause came along, there was a rubber wristband for it. But one of those said WWJD. Anybody remember what that stood for? What would Jesus do? Yeah. I want to suggest to you this morning that I would much rather put on that the letters WWJS. Who would Jesus see? Isn't that at the heart of who we are and what we're called to be and who we're called to follow and everything about discipleship? Pretty much. That's not to say it's everything. There's obviously a lot that nourishes that. There are a lot of things about reading our Bibles and being engaged in prayer, and yes, eating at this table. There's a whole lot more than just seeing what Jesus sees. But inevitably, when we see who Jesus sees, we're then going to do what Jesus would do, seeing who that is we're seeing. It's one of the things that's probably making this a real inflection point in our national life, and I'm not going to get into a whole long thing about that, but we really need to be people with eyes open, to see the people around us. And if Jesus is giving us just one message today, because that's also a good thing Jesus did. He was better at doing single-point sermons than probably I am. It's who's thirsty that needs that cup of cold water? Pour some.